So, welcome everyone to a very interesting episode we're having streaming tonight. For those who may have watched my shorts, I did an invite to a number of people who ever watched it. Looks like there's a lot of people that like my shorts, so that's nice. So I put an advert to let people know for tonight. I'm going to cover a debate with Cliff Knechtle and Matt Dillahunty. They had it actually in 2024. I think I may have originally said 2025. It was actually 2024. That's just a couple of years back, but a very interesting debate. As I say, I've watched it all the way through, as I mentioned last week, and I've made notes all the way through from start to finish of all the key points that I think are worth looking at and worth reviewing. And I want to draw my conclusions, but I also am quite happy for any atheists to come on board. Many atheists have been watching my streams because on the shorts, at least more than the lengthy streams themselves, has been a great deal of comments, and I have been absolutely flooded with them. And I've done my best to respond to every single one, and I will continue to do that as my genuine honesty to look for truth. And I won't ignore people's comments if they're genuine, and most of them have been okay. I mean, one or two, I guess you would always get one or two that are clearly not worth replying to because of the manner, whether it's very disrespectful and insulting, or whatever it may be, or just not relevant. Then, of course, I will skip those. But those where they have a genuine question or put forward a genuine point that they believe is true, whether or not it is, doesn't matter. It's an opinion, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. And that's a very key point, their opinion, because this is very much what this debate is about opinion to a large extent, as well as trying to get the facts at the same time. So I think it's going to be a very interesting debate that for those who've actually watched it, that will give you an added benefit of being able to kind of look at this in a more a closer way to see whether um, what I'm explaining and everything else lines up, and whether it does add some value, because I think it does. I think it's one of those debates where it's not easy to kind of appreciate and understand the value of what's being said at the time. You can easily be persuaded one way or the other to think this is correct or this is convincing, but only on time of reflection, and you spend more time looking at this, which I've certainly done. I think I've come up with some really really good points. And the way I've structured this is I've taken what I would say is the key points, made them as like a heading, and then we take the heading, and then I'll have a quote, or more likely a paraphrase of that quote, because sometimes both Cliff and Matt will go into a bit of a spiel, which could be very lengthy. And I've just taken the key bits to paraphrase what I think they're trying to say, what is important, and review that so that you get a very, what I would like to say is an honest response. I'm not going to be biased. I'm going to honestly assess the comments made, and put my view of that, which is all part of what the objective is to view this debate. So hopefully you're going to find it interesting. I don't know how long it's going to take, but maybe an hour and a bit. Not particularly long. I wouldn't have thought, maybe max hour and a half, but certainly not a long one, but a useful one. And of course, you can go back if you go on YouTube and look up the debate between those two individuals and put in your search for "Is Christianity True?" That was the debate title, and click those names with that. You'll get the YouTube video. It's still out there, so you can still watch it. As I say, that was back in 2024. Now, I've done a few things in the past as well, and I've been spending a fair bit of time on atheism recently because it's just an area that I have a particular liking to, and I do have a reasonable level of affinity to it because I've done a lot of research. I do study this as my own personal thing, and as well as my faith, of course. I find the whole matter of trying to explain how we got here, the universe, life, morality, and all those kind of type of philosophical questions, if you like, it's always been of an interest to me. So I thought I would spend a bit more time on it, and I've had some good responses, even though so far no atheist has joined the stream or tried to join yet. they've certainly been very vocal in the comments. To put it mildly, I've had literally 300 or 400 comments, and I've had over now 2,500 views of various different videos of mine, and most of those are the atheist view videos. So it does show they are listening, they're watching, they're responding. So maybe in the background they might listen to this and respond. We'll wait and see. For those who do watch it, I hope you enjoy it. Please do hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It does help get and promote the videos, because I really want to try and improve getting my message out there, and that's not easy as said and done. I have to be patient with that, but certainly the short videos have really helped. There's been a huge response to that. So, as I say, it's been over 2,500 views already on those videos, and that is climbing. So that's really, really positive. So I don't know whether, because these particular streams are, of course, more lengthy, it might be many of you just don't have the time or patience or whatever to watch those kind of more lengthy streams. But this one won't be too bad. It'll be about an hour once I get started, and it will hopefully be of interest. The fact it's on a debate as well, which has been a very widely viewed debate. There's over 2 million views on that one debate. So it was one of those big ones, and I will do others as well. I'm going to, just so you know, I'm going to look at one or two other debates that are really prominent between atheism and Christianity, and also I'm going to respond to some of the videos and websites out there on atheism. I think one of them was recommended me was it Generation something? I forgot, Deconstruction something, which I did one short video on when he looked at 2 Samuel 21. I'll look at a few more of his shorts as well, and I will provide responses to that as well, because he's quite a prominent atheist out there. He certainly knows Matt Dillahunty. I've seen they've done videos together. So I want to address him as well. I won't address directly so much Matt, because from what I see lately, I think his health has deteriorated. So I don't want to put too much attention to him in case he's interested to respond and won't really have the health to respond well. The last one or two videos I watched of his, he looked like he was struggling a bit. So I will probably leave him alone from any kind of direct interaction. But that's not to say I won't do some reviews of any of the others videos or debates he's done in the past. Any prominent atheist, I will do that, as well as, of course, put the case for Christianity at the same time, which is what this video is all about. It is the case of, is Christianity true? Now, we'll be honest, as much as that is the topic, the debate has really kind of moved a bit into the directions about more whether there's a case for God, and whether what's the basis or evidence for God. And that seems to be where it's shifted, though Christianity to some degree is still covered in the debate. It did tend to be more about that, and you'll see what I mean when I go through the cases. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen with my summary, and we can just go through this together and see what you think. All right, I'll share my screen. Okay, let's make sure I can. Oh, what's this one? Whole screen. Oh, it's got a star in it. Let's see what happens here. Yep. There we have it. Right. So, this is, like I say, the response to the debate of Cliff Connect. I don't know how to pronounce that surname. And Matt Dillahunty of 2024. So, maybe I will make myself small. It's just struggling to see this. That's better. And let me see if I can make it any bigger. Yep. That's a lot better. Let's do that then. So, first one is the reality of good and evil. Do these things exist? So Matt's point was, I am convinced that good and evil are real based on life experiences. So he's basically saying that from his experience in his own life, he believes there are such things. So what else does it say? He's evil based on life experiences prior to that created these, but not convinced that there is some sort of mind or values. So basically, He's basically just saying they exist, um, and so on. Cliff said, well, his point would be, from a Christian perspective, is that these are innate qualities that we have within us, which is what we call objective morality. So just to explain a little better, what we're saying here is when we talk about good and evil, we would say, even though Matt didn't precisely agree, in a sense, I think in a way he did, that they do exist in the mind, because it's through our mental capacity do we register and understand whether something is good or evil. So it is something that only works in the mind. It can't work anywhere else. That's the source of establishing these qualities. Um, and so the point being here is, if they exist in the mind, as many other things exist in the mind, like consciousness, rationality, and logic as well, why would it not be that the source of these things also come from a mind? They don't come from anywhere else, only from a mind. Therefore, why not the source also be likely that it came from a mind? Of course, it would be a superior mind, a greater mind than human mind. That would be a case for God, if you like, to explain the source of these qualities. Okay, moving on. Basis of verifying Christianity is true. So Matt suggests the method is not different to any other religion. In a way, he's right for many points. We only know what is true based on the Bible, only claims from people, etc., resurrection of Christ. It cannot be true only if it is demonstrable. Demonstrable. Okay. So don't accept it must be supernatural unless we know of all natural possibilities. So what is he really trying to say here? Of course, uh, Cliff is really just saying that, we are basing it on the Bible, and we base on the validity of the Bible and the claims within the Bible, because they can be demonstrable true by historical basis. But again, Matt is saying that's not good enough for him. This is where it gets interesting, because he is saying that, well, it's still a book, it's still written, it's part of history. I wasn't around at the time. How could I ever prove any of that? And that's the same for any bit of history, really, whatever the book is. So that for me is a little bit of a weak argument, because that's really not being fair to history. Because why would we believe anything of history if we have to do it on the basis that I can't be demonstrated in front of me that it's true, therefore I can't believe it? So I would say that's a bit of an unfair uh, qualification to whether you want to believe of anything historical. And that is, of course, the basis for Christianity to a large extent, is what Cliff is saying, is by the Bible. And that is very different to other religions, very simply because each religion has its own standard, and you can test this. So if there is something within the religion that is clearly false based on what it claims, then you could dismiss it, eliminate it from that list. And of course, we can do that with a number of different religions. But what my claim here, the Cliff is saying, you can't do that with Christianity, because it does stand up to scrutiny. Certainly, things like the prophecies in the Bible, the crucifixion of Christ, um, highly attested in history. Of course, we can't absolutely prove it, and it's a bit of a silly point by, I think, Matt, to try and demand that type of level of proof for something that's historical. But that's how he mentioned it. But there are other methods. And of course, there is an element of supernatural. Now, supernatural, I just want to explain, isn't just one way. Supernatural can be in a number of different ways. One would be is, for example, if I prophesied that in 100 years' time a certain event was going to take place, and I prophesied it in quite some detail, that would be supernatural, because humans can't predict the future. That's not possible within our realms. So that would take something supernatural to achieve, to accomplish that. That's called supernatural in other respects, like healing. many Christians, including myself, claim that we have been healed in a supernatural way. In my particular case, I was prayed on. Of course, if somebody just prays for somebody, which is just somebody speaking out loud, we know scientifically, medically, whatever, it does not heal certain things. Certainly, nothing physical. In my case, my back, um, it just fixed itself clearly, miraculously, supernaturally. So that was another example of supernatural occurrences. So the problem, of course, is here is unless you receive or experience a supernatural event yourself, you are going to find it very hard to convince whether it's true. But that doesn't mean it's not. And it doesn't mean it isn't worth considering. Because, for example, if billions of Christians, especially, have claimed that they have been healed and have received supernatural experiences, they've had answers to prayer from God, etc., and amazing things have happened in their life, and that is evidence. It's not, of course, absolute, but it's still evidence. So that's where I would take that on board on that point. Matt cannot prove Jesus using scientific method, notably the resurrection. Well, yes, okay, Matt, you're right. But is that the right method? I mean, you can't keep relying on this, have to be by scientific methods. Not everything can be proven scientifically. So that is a wrong method for the wrong purpose. The way that you would prove the resurrection, well, I say prove, you can't really prove it, but the way you would put a case for the resurrection is based on eyewitness testimonies, the writings in the Bible, because that were historically writings of events at the time. There was also many other writings that talked about people that saw Jesus after his death, and so forth. Again, it's not absolute, but like Cliff said, not everything can be proven that way. Good example of that was love. How can you prove that somebody loves you using a scientific method? It's just not possible. But somebody does love you, you're convinced well enough, but you can never be absolutely sure. So this is again a theme I'm picking up very early on, is this emphasis about demonstrable evidence, which is really kind of almost like absolute material evidence. Even that is, of course, not absolute, but it's as closest thing you can get. That if, for example, you want evidence of, I don't know, what would be a good example? That it rains, say. All you have to do is wait one day until it rains. And when it rains, you can believe, well, it's raining. There's an outside chance it could be some trick where somebody up in some big, huge plane has put and captured, I don't know, maybe 2 million tons of water and put them on their big, huge aircraft, and then just put it through a system where it just drops to give the effect of rain. But it isn't actually rain. But of course, we have all some extra evidence as well. We have to rely on all the research that's done and all the rest of it. And it's a fairly convincing argument that you would say that you're 99.99% sure that rain is real, and that's a fairly good assessment, because at least with rain you can get a very good demonstrable case of evidence for rain, but not the same as love or friendship, for example, or other things that you simply are not in your midst, within your persona, that allow you to properly test it. And of course, science can't test all these things; can only test certain things. So certain things we have to take for granted. We have to put a level of trust and faith in, and that's part of life. So these are definitely things that we constantly have to deal with, so shouldn't be ignored, and therefore should not be excluded for being part of that evidence. It's just a different type of evidence, is the way I would look at it. Now, this one I thought Matt had a good point. Be honest, this was comparing natural with supernatural. As much as, yeah, you can't really compare the two. So, of course, the evidence for the natural is a lot easier than the supernatural. But I would say this: the methods of investigating the evidence is different. So how would you test a supernatural event? Very difficult. And this is where I think Matt really needs to be somewhat really challenged. And he wasn't really challenged well enough, I don't think, by Cliff. Sorry, Cliff. I just didn't personally think you scrutinized him well on this. And that is to say, whatever supernatural event, if it happened in front of you, you still wouldn't believe. And there was a good case that actually Matt was asked, what happens if God presented himself right in front of you? Would you still then believe that God exists? And he still wouldn't, because he would say, who knows to say that it's some sort of trick or whatever it may be, or some sort of alien or whatever. And not to say that Matt said that, but you know, you get my point. He kind of said, well, he still wouldn't believe. He still would have doubts. And this is where I'm starting to bring in this point here, which I'll end in my review at the end, is for me, this is a level of skepticism. You know, it's like, well, unless it's absolutely in front of me, then it's just impossible to really convince me that it's true. Any other method is just simply not included. And therefore, you can put any excuse or barrier to the evidence to say it's not satisfactory to you, unless it is of that highest level. And for me, that is really missing a trick, I think. And you'll get to see why I'm saying that as we go through the next points. Number 4, comparing the Bible to the Quran. How is the Bible more historically accurate? And the Cliff said, well, in the Gospels, a tremendous amount of internal consistency. The issue here is we can evaluate the two books more extensively. So this, for me, as I know a lot about the Quran as well as the Bible, this is a very easy comparison, because in the Quran, it makes one, it claims that it's directly from God. Therefore, every word said in the Quran is allegedly God's word, and therefore it will be free of even human error from that perspective. It also does make that claim that it's perfectly preserved. It does say so in the book as well. So it says it's free from error. So every word and everything is accurate. And therefore, when it's making such a high standard, it leaves it open to scrutiny, which means if you can prove that it doesn't hold up to that standard, then it clearly cannot be God, because it's claimed to be God's word. And if, of course, God, being all powerful, knowing, wouldn't be making any mistakes. He wouldn't get anything in error. He wouldn't contradict himself, and so forth. But the Quran doesn't stop there. It talks about how it's confirming the previous scriptures. It claims that the previous scriptures are also from God, and so on and so on. But then you find contradictions. It doesn't agree with the previous scriptures. There's internal contradictions. It's not perfectly preserved, because there's over 30 different Qurans with different Arabic words in different Qurans, and there's many verses that have been discovered that it didn't end up in the Quran, and so on. So we have a way of testing it, whereas the Bible, you don't have those issues. Now, there are some level of contradictions which we would agree is either scribal errors, because there are scribal errors, because it wasn't absolute God's word. There was a level of people that were inspired by God, but still having a human element to it. So there will be, like, for example, when one or two of the apostles are writing about an event, they would have two different perspectives. But just like an investigator or newsreader or whatever would be looking at a particular event, and they write up an article on that event, they won't be perfectly matched. There will be a level of discretion, if you like, between the two writers in their understanding and perception of that event. And of course, they're looking at it from a slightly different perspective, and a different angle, whatever. So there are going to be a level of differences in that sense. But there is no issue or contradiction in the core messages. Now, some stuff in the Bible is up to interpretation, so we're not sure how to interpret certain scripture. Of course, some of the Genesis account is a bit difficult because it's a bit limited. Certainly some of the events as well. I know some atheists have challenged the Bible, and when they have challenged the Bible, they're not easy questions to answer. But there is nothing that I would say that is absolutely clearly wrong and can be provably wrong or in error in terms of what's written in the Bible. And so that's where we're talking about the level of authenticity, accuracy, reliability, just completely superior to the Quran in every department. And that's why we say the Bible does stand up to scrutiny. So from that perspective, that is like a prerequisite that if you are going to believe a book as part of your belief in God, in this case in Christianity, the book has got to be solid. And certainly the Bible has tested over time to be such a book. Some of the authors in the Bible are anonymous. Matt said in the opening of the book of Matthew shows no identification of who wrote it. I will simply say, well, so what? A writer doesn't have to say, oh, I'm Matthew, I'm the writer of this book. He could open up his dialogue or narrative on how he wants to write his book in whatever way he chooses. So that's no proof either way. Of course, we do know that there is a lot of evidence that the people, the writers of the book, definitely two of them at least, were around at the time of Jesus, if not all four. So there's good evidence for that. I mean, it's not an absolute case, of course, and this became part of the difficulty here, but they certainly were writers and that would have been either self witnesses of Jesus themselves or thereabouts or close to. Um, so there is a lot more. Maybe it's something I'll cover one week, but certainly the writers of the Gospels would have been around the time of Jesus. There's a lot of evidence that's true, and who they are. And definitely Matthew was Matthew, Luke was Luke, and Mark was Mark, and John was John. And there's some good evidence to back that up. Matt said then more recently writings on this is more reliable. And they will therefore have more of a case to base it on. So what he was saying here was a bit of a weird one, but I kind of get it. He was trying to say, well, now that we are looking at it from 2,000 years later or whatever, we have a lot more at our disposal, and technology and research has improved. So we should be able to scrutinize these books a lot more closely than what was done back then. Now, that's true, of course, but that doesn't mean it's more reliable necessarily, because it also comes with bias. It comes with anybody that's got any kind of ulterior motive could start coming up with all sorts of writings and claims or whatever that could not necessarily be true, and then add, sort of muddy the waters, if you like. So, but even so, even with that evidence we have now and the research that would be performed now, still would require to look at what was the best evidence closer to the time. Because this is the simple reason. If I personally witnessed a car accident today and I write about it in, say, a week's time, would you not think that my record of that event is going to be a lot more significant and reliable than taking anybody's third hand, fourth hand version of the account? Maybe they got it from whoever got it from somebody else, maybe a year later, and then maybe 50 years later, somebody's writing about it. Where's he going for his source? If he's going to try and get an accurate account of that event, he's probably going to look at my source, my record, as the most important, because I was the one closest to the event, if not the one who actually witnessed it in person. So there is a lot to be said for looking at the earliest writings and events on as a way to substantiate any historical event. So there is a case for that. So yes, you can have the benefit of you've got more access to you, but you've also got a lot of access to false information as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you've got all this additional information, and yes, there may be more information that's been uncovered, of course, and that does play a part. So what that really means is that any time from a timeline of, say, an event that happened 100 years ago, in year 1 to 2 would be the most important because that's very fresh. Thereafter, there might be more witnesses, but we don't know of them. Then they may have been uncovered 50 years later. And that's where the benefit of later on would come into play. And I would accept that. But still, that doesn't take away the authenticity and reliability of the earliest events, because those are the ones that are most crucial, because they're more likely to be true because they were so close. Because, of course, your memory of the event will be a lot better because it only happened last week. From somebody who writes about an event 50 years later, he's going to start to struggle, remember the detail. So there is all that to be taken into account. So I didn't think that was a fair point that Matt raised, even though I do accept to some degree some validity in it. I think, unfortunately, Cliff didn't really take that up and say, wait a minute, what about this? What about this? And so on. So it was a bit of a kind of got away with that comment. And I would say, really, I would have said it's not that straightforward. But generally speaking, when we look at history, we want to look at the earliest sources as our priority on getting the facts together. New Testament scholars of the Bible. Matt, the early Christian scholars were very much in disagreement with each other. Now, this is where Cliff did make a very good point. Well, this is just simply not true. They did disagree in terms of, shall we say, interpretation of certain verses. I mean, there were the whole thing about the Trinity, for example, some other doctrines as well, and some other interpretations. These were definitely something that were part of the discussions between the earliest Christians and scholars. And yeah, they have some different views. But what wasn't different was the basic core tenets and teachings of the Bible. So that's where, like what Cliff was really trying to put his good point here was that, there wasn't really a disagreement in the way you're trying to suggest. There was a very clear understanding of what the gospel was, what God's plan was, how you're saved, who is God. I would accept the Trinity was a slightly different one. The understanding that Jesus was God wasn't fully agreed and understood straight away. But many did agree that he was divine. And of course, a lot of them did believe, even Jews would claim that though they don't believe Jesus was God, you've got to read the scriptures closely, because the Jews were claiming that Jesus himself was claiming to be good based on what he did say, based on the titles he gave himself and so forth, based on the fact that he called himself the Son of God, and God is my Father, and me and him are one. He's in me and I am in him, and so on, and all these different phrases that he mentioned. The Jews picked up that and said, well, by you saying such and such, you are claiming to be God. So it is in Scripture that Jesus was claiming to be divine, and it was also confirmed by Thomas and others, that, when they responded to him, like in John 20:28, that many did identify Jesus as God, and certainly you've got other scriptures which identify Jesus as God. So this was already a belief and understanding, but it obviously developed and become more and more better understood, shall we say. And that's when the Trinity came along, because all the Trinity was doing was taking the understanding that the Father is God, Jesus is God, the Spirit is God, based on what's in the Bible. And therefore, and the fact it also says there's only one God, there's then a deductive logic to say, therefore, that one God is made up of the Father, Son, and Spirit. But yet you can see by the way it's worded in the Bible, way it's grammatically phrased, they clearly are distinct. So that's where the Trinity came from that. And all that was just the Trinity being an established way of giving a name to the concept that clearly exists in the Old and New Testament. Number 7, the evidence of the resurrection. So Matt said we don't really have any empirical evidence that would satisfy him. So, of course, Cliff went on to say what we did have. We've got all the eyewitness testimonies and what they wrote. They've also got the accounts of external writings about that Jesus was witnessed by others after his death. There was the empty tomb, of course, which couldn't be explained. We also know that many apostles gave their lives away in the belief that he was resurrected. They even gave their life. Why would they do that if it wasn't true? So there is a case. I accept again Matt with his high level of skepticism here. Basically, is saying unless it's empirical, I'm not going to believe it. So that's an impossible task to anyone to prove that somebody was resurrected, especially if you weren't there to witness it. What are you going to do? But here's the problem, I think, with Matt. Even if he did witness the resurrection in front of his own eyes, he would probably say they probably weren't dead to begin with, or it's some sort of trick or whatever. So this is where the skepticism really does kick in high to say, well, at the end of the day, he's convinced it's impossible for somebody to be resurrected, so he would always put an excuse to say, that's why I'm not convinced. And it is an impossible one. And really what I'm saying here is, okay, Matt, what is the evidence that you would be happy with? And this is something Cliff did bring out a few times. So what evidence are you looking for? And he says, well, Matt's best answer was, well, I don't know. So far, whatever evidence has been provided hasn't been satisfactory. But I don't know what would be satisfactory. If that isn't skepticism, I don't know what is. So that's where I'm thinking that's not really a valid way to respond, I don't think, personally. But anyway, that's how that went. Number 8, Bible's authenticity based on manuscript copies. So Matt was saying this is a fallacious argument that the Bible is credible based on the number of copies. Cliff said that, well, there are 4 testable ways to determine the reliability of the Bible. And that's a very good point that Cliff made here. One was the literary style. So, of course, if the style is the same, there's a good case that it's the same writer, very consistent about writing whatever book that he's writing. Because if the style changes, then that would be definitely a red flag. Manuscript evidence absolutely is very key. So that when any book is written down, if they make many copies of it and they distribute those copies around, that helps prove that that was an authentic book. Because if you make loads of copies of a book, if I write a book today and I start making copies from today and I get other people to make copies and we quickly make 1 million copies within the next, I don't know, 6 months or whatever it may be, and quickly get all that distributed, it will produce a level of reliability. Because if it was that this wasn't the true book, you'd have variations all over the place. Because with making so many copies, you would be able to make that comparison. You could do that check to say, well, do all the copies line up? And if they do, which of course they do, wherever in the world you go, the Bible is basically the same. There's slight differences because of translation and wording changes in the way that they interpret the original Hebrew and Greek or whatever. But the messages are absolutely the same. John 1:5 is John 1:5, wherever you go. It's not a different sentence. It's not different, whatever. So there's some variations of word because how you translate a certain word in Greek could be translated with one English word or another. So some different books use different words. And then, of course, some Bible translations change the style of the sentence because they believe it doesn't read well. A good example of that is the King James. It's an old version. The literary style isn't quite right. So you have, say, things like the ESV or whatever, different versions. But at the end of the day, it's exactly the same message. And again, that is part of the evidence of the reliability of the Bible. Then there's the archaeology in terms of all the fragments and parchments that we have discovered. And some of them have been dated very, very old, all of which tie and agree to the Bible we have today. And then last is contradictions. Slightly an interesting topic, this one, because some atheists, and I'm going to definitely cover some of this, believe that there are contradictions in the Bible. Now, as I said, there are contradictions in terms of scribal errors, and there could be contradictions in terms of a different viewpoint, but a true contradiction, I'm not so sure. I haven't personally come across one, but I will look into that and look at what the atheists come up with as their top 10, shall we say, of contradictions they believe exist, and then we'll go through that one day and see if it's true. So, but those are the 4 cases of reliability that Cliff put forward, and I thought that was a really good point to say that it's not just simply a case of looking at manuscripts. There's a lot more to this. So I thought Cliff made a very good valid point on that one. And then, of course, Matt's response to the 4 points of that was criteria. Matt said that some stories are not true, some contradictions, but you can't say for certain. Well, again, the problem with that is using even Matt's criteria of evidence. How can you prove anything is true that's historical? What we do have is we don't have any event of major historical event that is then proven to be true by archaeology or any other way that says those events didn't happen the way it's been written in the Bible, so recorded in the Bible. So that shows a level of reliability then. That's one of the things that Cliff was bringing out is when we look at the history, these events took place. When it talks about various kings, various wars, conflicts, and so on, a lot of this has been confirmed by archaeology and by other historical writings that are independent of the Bible. So there's definitely some great case, and nothing has ever come up where it said, no, that is completely false. That didn't happen. This is what happened instead. That has never been the case. So that really is a good case why the Bible is definitely reliable. And I think that was a good point that I think Cliff did put to that point. Now moving on to number 10. No methodology to prove the supernatural. Again, Matt was saying he doesn't know of any method that could convince him that the supernatural can be tested and proven to be true. Now, you're right, Matt. That's absolutely the case. Based on that level of standard, this empirical level that you keep demanding, it's not how it works for the supernatural. So you're never going to get proven ever because you can always come up with an excuse. And I like an analogy. Somebody said, well, when it talks about all the amazing supernatural things that we can't explain in the universe, we could just say, well, maybe it all came from aliens who happened to be here billions of years before us, and they'd reached to a high level of superiority and in intellect, where they had the ability to do all these various things that we can't explain, and they put it together, and that's how it all happened. They were the ones, the masterminds, if you like, behind all the things that cannot be answered. And, it's an option. So here's the problem with this. As much as that is that's a valid point in some respects, what is most likely? We have no case of aliens whatsoever. But the case is, what do we have? We have no evidence of any other living species. Of course, if there was aliens, the same question still will be asked, well, where did they come from? Where was the beginning, the source of the universe? Where was the source of aliens? They couldn't have always existed. And if they did, what's the difference between that and God? Because if you can believe there's aliens that always exist, why can't you believe that God always existed? Except what is a more sensible and logical answer? Because with aliens, we don't have any communication from them. We don't have anything that's where they're showing up, if you like, and say, here we are, here's our book, there's our evidence, here's our communication, and here's how you can communicate with us. Because don't forget, Christians have, including myself, evidence that we have a communication directly with God. We pray to God and we get answers. That's a one-to-one direct relationship there. So if aliens existed, where's the relationship and the evidence for it? We don't. So as much as I'm not saying that aliens don't exist, the evidence for God is far, far better as an option to believe in. So, yep, you're right. No methodology in terms of the standards, Matt, that you are proposing. But again, you're using the wrong methodology for the wrong evidence required for the supernatural. Just as much as you can't use that same method to prove psychological validations or people's feelings and expressions, you just can't use that kind of evidence for that. You can never prove if somebody really loves you, whether there's something's really genuine. You really cannot absolutely prove it, but you do base it on the evidence you've got to convince you. And if that level of convincement is strong enough to be better than to believe that it's not true, then you should go with it. and that's how I would evaluate that. But that's again, that's a theme that's coming through, this consistency of continually asking for the wrong type of methodology to convince Matt of evidence of certain things. The order of the Genesis count is absolutely wrong. So this is a very good point Matt has put here, to be brutally honest, because it's basically saying that the sun, by a certain science, is saying that came before Earth. But in the Bible, it says the opposite. It says that the Earth came before the sun. Now, the only problem with this is, it is interesting that Matt has even said this, of course, because he can't even prove it himself. He can't prove that the sun came before the Earth. It's not absolutely provable. What do I mean by that? We're relying on a level of science, a level of research that can't go back in time to absolutely prove it, but it base it on what evidence they've got, and then there's a whole bundle of presuppositions and assumptions that are made based on the scientific approach, which is fine, and I think that's valid to do so. But it does beg the question that doesn't absolutely prove, because it's still possible they could be wrong here, because the sun, basically, well, let me just kind of explain it. So basically, in the way that the sun is operating, the way it's reducing, it's kind of burning down, if you like, that you can work that backwards in a way in terms of the rate of deterioration, that it would kind of suggest, if that was the natural process that started from the very beginning when the sun first appeared, then we would say you're right, and that would go back, say, 2 billion years, say, if that calculation was consistent and true all the way to the point of its beginning. That's the assumption that you have made. So based on the evidence where they can go back only so many thousands of years, that's good evidence that if the sun lost 1% of its heat capacity every year, not 1%, of course, but say 0.0001%, whatever that tiny percentage is, and it's consistent, the year is also losing the same rate, you can very quickly mathematically calculate that back to multiplying that percentage out by the number of times to get it to a whole number, to 100%. That's 2 billion years down the road. That's the basis. So, well, the Earth, calculated based on what we know of the Earth, is only, I don't know, say 20,000 years old, or whatever it may be, or 1 billion years. Let's make it easy. 1 billion years old, but the sun has been calculated by that method as 2 billion. On that basis, that would be true, and that would make the Bible false. The problem with this is, we don't know if that rate of continuation went all the way back to a source beginning. What I mean by that is, if God created the sun, then he may have created the sun that's already in a certain state, not as old as what we would have understood based on this calculation. So, from the point that the sun was created, it may not have been undergoing that rate of loss to begin with. We just don't know. So there's no way of proving it either way. And I certainly would agree it's a difficult one, and we don't have an answer for it. We have to rely on the Bible being true. And it's just one of those unanswered questions. So I'm sorry. The problem there is we've got a bit of a double standard going on here, because there's no way that Matt would ever agree to say that's proof, because his own standard says, unless there's empirical proof that you can demonstrably prove that the sun is older than the Earth, then I'm not going to believe it. And you should be applying that same rule, Matt, if you're going to apply it to this. But yeah, he did make a case to say, well, there's where the Bible's wrong, because it's contradicting what we know of science. Well, that's the double standard, because we don't really know. We haven't got absolute proof of it. It's based on a whole bundle of assumptions in addition to the science that we do know. So it's not an absolute case whatsoever. Number 12, the experience of the supernatural game was brought up. Seems to be a bit of a theme, this one. As much as we can claim it's from God, there's no way of proving it. Again, I wouldn't agree. There's no way of proving it, but no way under your standard of skepticism is where I would agree, Matt. your method of evidence, which you're only requiring unless it's demonstrable true, I'm not going to believe it. But even then, as I said, even if it's in your face, in front of you, you still wouldn't believe it, because unless it's part of something that is natural, you're not going to believe it. And of course, there is only certain things that we could say is absolutely natural, and there are many things that we would say that doesn't fit that model. Just unexplainable things. And those things that, if they can't be testable, then they're not demonstrably proven to be absolutely true. So you'll be stuck, Matt, with that dilemma for the rest of your life, because there's just no way of absolutely proving um, the answer to that question either way. It's just not possible. So that goes the same with the Bible, why we believe in the Bible, how we believe in God. We don't have absolute proof. None of us Christians who really, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, but some Christians are silly enough to say, yeah, God is absolutely true, 100%. We can't say that. In the Bible itself, it says that it's based on a level of faith. God gives us enough information, enough evidence, and the rest is down to faith, down to a level of trust. It's a bit like, I was actually speaking to my wife earlier today about, a good way of looking at it is like putting your money on a horse to win a race. You can't say for certain that that horse is going to win. But because you know so much about the horse, you've got enough evidence about it, and you know enough about all the other horses, you can eliminate their no way is good and all the rest of it. You could put a lot of trust in, and that would be reflected in the fact that you put a lot of money on that horse winning the event. You can't absolutely prove that horse is going to win it. It's not possible, no matter which method you use. It's physically impossible. So you can't use that method. But the evidence you've got, if you've got enough evidence that shows that this horse is far superior than all the other horses, won so many races before, you've got records of the speeds that it's been running at, and so on and so on, and you're comparing it to the other horses, this is by far the best case for who potentially could win. That's why you're putting your money. And that's no different in putting the case for God, is putting your trust in God versus your alternative options. Because there must be an option, because we exist. So there can't be, well, we don't have an answer. There has to be an answer because we exist. Because we can't just come from nowhere. We exist because there is something that put us here to begin with. It's just, what is it? Is it more likely that it's just nothing, or just some gas, whatever you want to call it, energy? Or is it something that more likely has intelligence, mind, purpose, and is personal? So these are the arguments why, like in my previous streams, why we're putting our money on that particular horse, because that case of evidence is the most strongest. So when it comes to the supernatural, yes, we do have some cases. What methods do we use? Of course, testimonies do count. I was supernaturally healed, and I'm one in millions and millions and millions of Christians that have claimed to have received this kind of supernatural healing. That is a form of evidence, not the absolute, but it's a form, and therefore should not be excluded, should be taken into account. And what you should do is put all the evidence together, like I mentioned last week on a crime scene. You put all the evidence together, and as much as you can't prove, one, that this person was murdered, and two, who by. But if you've got enough evidence to suggest that's what took place, and it was Joe Bloggs was the person who committed the murder, you will convict him. And Matt would see that on the television, in the news, watch the whole court case, went through all the weeks of all the deliberation and questions and cross-examinations and whatever. With the verdict, he would say, what I've watched, I'm also convinced that guy was the murderer and he should be put in jail, whatever, sentenced. So that's what you're doing. See, that's not an absolute, that's not demonstrable, but you'll still go along to believe it because the evidence is the most convincing, to the point it's worth convicting. Is the evidence for God enough to convict you to believe in it? But it will never be absolute. So stop going down the road of being skeptical here, Matt. and saying it has to be this method, any other method. And then even when you can't pin to that, you say, well, I don't know if there is a method. I've not seen a method that would satisfy me into believing God is real. But the problem with that is you're creating a standard that's simply not reasonable. That's the problem. Moving on, number 13. We've only got a few more to go. Now, how is Cliff not a cynical? It's not a cynic to atheism. Cliff getting answers to meaning of life and there's life after death, etc. Matt it just rips into the shreds based on some of the forms of intellectual basis. Matt, I went over the 4 points to debunk them. That's why that's not being a cynic. So, what are we saying here? So, this whole thing about being Matt being a bit cynical actually on this. Well, I think rather than Cliff, although maybe a bit of both, I don't know. But I think it was actually the other way around. I think it was Matt that was being cynical because basically, Matt being claimed to be cynical. We say, no, I wasn't because I put forward and addressed your 4 points. But it wasn't how you addressed the 4 points, it's how he addressed them. And again, all he really did was basically saying, which I think is a good case why I think Matt was cynical here rather than Cliff, was again, he was always asking for this empirical demonstrative proof that would be the only basis to believe. So therefore, you can wipe out the supernatural, you can wipe out historical archaeology. Who knows whether the archaeology is true? Could have been fake. You just don't know. Again, you can keep putting up these barriers, which I think has just been very skeptical because it's almost impossible, really. In other words, to prove Matt convincingly that anything from a Christian perspective is true for that on that basis, and that's where he didn't really debunk the 4 points. He was just saying that the standard that he has to convince him any of those is simply not good enough for him. But again, it goes back to, is he demanding the right method of proof against each of the different concepts? I would say no, because that's always the case with anything historical or anything that's not natural. Cannot be explained and proven in that way. In fact, to be honest, nothing can be really proven, even in the natural. Can we really prove we're here? Oh, this is not some sort of, I don't know, trick. Somebody's just playing. We're pretending that we exist and we think we exist and we think everybody else around us is real and all the rest of it. But we're never absolutely certain. We're not certain of anything in life. And that's just the way it is. So you have to kind of be a bit more logical and rational about what is the right methodology and basis that would make us believe what we believe. Of course, believing that we are real is one of the easier things to believe, so that's not so difficult. And Matt would at least take that level and agree that would be for him demonstrable to believe in. But anything beyond that, completely writes off. So history, that's out the window because he wasn't there to see it. Anything that isn't clearly proven in front of him. So that's a whole thousands of things that are just unexplainable. Then again, we would just write those off straight away. So what do you do? It's just part of, for me, not an appropriate response. And I will come to my conclusion why that is at the end. Proof only based, as I said, on the natural world. That leads us nicely onto the next point. Matt only is convinced on the natural world where there is a way to provide solid evidence. So again, he's only relying on solid evidence. Anything outside of that, he's simply ignoring because it cannot be absolutely proven, which is true. But then is that the appropriate approach? Because there's so many things that clearly can't be proven that way, but we know exists. So what are we going to do about it? Because if there's something significantly attached to any of this, certainly in the case of love, it's very significant, of course. If you can't prove there's love, then you're not convinced there's love, then you're going to find it very hard to have a loving relationship with anyone. So the consequences are significant if you can't truly believe in when persons express their love. If you want to be super, super skeptical, then that's where the conclusion you would draw, which is clearly ridiculous, of course. But that's the point. Just believe in a natural world, and the only things where there's a method, direct method to prove it, is the only method to me is really missing an awful lot. The origin of the universe. This is where we kind of then moving a bit more into, again, as you've noticed, into talking about the universe than about Christianity. So the origin of the universe was brought up. Matt said there is, a scientific question about the empirical fact. Any answer questions just means science hasn't worked it out yet, which I think is an absolute cop out. Science would agree very, very strongly that we are very, very limited as humans to be able to prove a lot. But what we're saying here is there are so many things that are so far, far more advanced than we could ever imagine that we just don't have answers for. And of course, there are things that happened thousands of years ago. We can't go back in time to replay it. So we just don't know. And there are things that simply, in terms of emotion and consciousness, the way the mind works, we simply can't get answers to that scientifically. There are many things that we can't prove scientifically. So going back to the origin of the universe, it doesn't mean that we can't have a strong idea of how the universe started. And we did cover this already in previous weeks. We have a lot of evidence. There's a lot of scientific theories that shows that the universe had a beginning. It definitely had a beginning, and that beginning had to be in time, had to be in space, and it had to be material. The researchers also proven that all these three things had to happen at the same time. So again, what does that mean? Well, if there's no beginning, where did everything come from? The universe has got strong evidence from scientific perspective that there was a beginning, and everything that has a beginning has a cause, and therefore the universe must be a cause. And when we look at the evidence of the universe, the most logical conclusion is it must have been something intelligent. It's far more likely that the source of the universe was from an intelligent source than not, and that it had a purpose and it had the ability and had to be also always existed, just because anything that had a beginning, therefore where did that come from? And of course we'd have infinite regression. So the very, very beginning of all that we know, the universe, must have came about from something that always existed, something that was outside of time, space, and matter. It's those deductive conclusions which draw us to the point that whatever that thing was that always existed is more likely to be something that is best described as God than not. And that's why we say, why aren't you at least believing that there potentially is a God on that basis alone, before we then talk about what God is and how can we identify that God versus all the other gods that exist? Because yes, there are a lot of claims of God exist from different religions. They can't all be right because they're believing in a different God, and there can only be realistically one God. But more importantly, what we can do is scrutinize those religions to see whether it stacks up, and if it starts to be proven clearly it's nonsense, it's made up, you can eliminate it. But will there be any left that passes that test? So that'd be one of the major tests, that if it can be proven there is nothing that clearly is false or clearly made up, then it should still be considered as an option. And you'll be surprised very quickly how you can eliminate many of these religions when you look into them. So that'd be something I might do one week, and just pick out maybe the top 10 whatever of religions and show you why they clearly can't be true. And obviously the case for Christ, for Christianity, will be part of one I will do as well. I have touched on this before, but I will touch on again to prove to you why, when you do this elimination of scrutinizing and testing religions, only Christianity is the one that will stand up to scrutiny. We then moved on to number 15. Where are we? 16 now. Bible standards. Matt said Bible standards over divorce is different for a man versus a woman. Really, not see the point of what he was on about here. A bit of a silly point. He did make it, raise it. Yeah, it is true, but then at the end of the day, God made man and woman with different roles and responsibilities. The Bible talks about how the man is the head of the marriage, and how the wife is to support the husband. It also talks about how the husband has to love and look after and cherish his wife, and so on. So there are different roles and responsibilities, and basically, when it comes to divorce, um, what God is offering is a principle, and then that principle is then applied based on laws, and that changes by man. So basically, man had the free will to choose how to implement that principle and come up with a particular law, and that's really what the divorce was a law based on the humans and the cultures of the time deciding on taking principles. In the case of this case, when they were using principles based on what God said and what the Bible was saying, then they would use that as their way of guiding them to provide the law. But at the end of the day, they provide the law. And don't forget that law changed over the years how divorce worked. So it wasn't that God spelt out, this is how you divorce, this is a precise method, all the steps, etc. What God provided was a principle. The main principle was that you should only really divorce if somebody commits adultery. Obviously, you can remarry as your partner passes away, or it's unreconcilable. And it doesn't really say it that way, but the principle kind of applies that, because if at the end of the day that there is a very unhealthy danger of staying with a partner, one good example would be that you feel that your life is being threatened. If your partner has those tendencies to attack you with putting your life at risk, then that would be obviously a case. So where there's principally a case like that, then yes. Otherwise, it's basically God is saying, do everything you can to stay together. Take your responsibilities seriously and work through your marriage. And don't, like we see today, sadly, people getting divorced for so many very silly reasons, very mild reasons. And that was never what God was intending. Basically, the Bible very clearly saying that it takes marriage very, very seriously. It's a contract. It's like a covenant, if you like, between man and woman, and should be taken very seriously and being honoured as best they can for the rest of their lives. Atrocities in the Bible. Now, this is a big topic. Matt definitely has a point here. There are some atrocities in the Bible, and that's why I can't believe it's from God, if there is a God. Now, the problem with this, with Matt, is coming things like slavery, genocide, and punishment. Is I would agree in principle that these are very difficult passages, and I myself struggle with some. I did cover 2 Samuel 21 the other day, but I would agree that there's no easy answer to these passages, and I will cover maybe some other ones as well. But ultimately, it's God's judgment, and God's judgment isn't just a flippant choice to decide to take a certain course of action. It was based on covenants that were set, that if you go against those covenants, they're very serious and there are consequences. If you go against God in such a very clear way in terms of your behavior, like believing in other gods, um, worshipping false gods, sacrificing humans as part of that worship, false worship, or whatever it may be, or simply going directly against God, but not just doing like on that odd occasion. But God gave many of these nations and peoples that were performing these bad acts, evil acts, if you like, plenty of warning over plenty of years, constantly reminding them, if you do not stop, I will cast judgment. So ultimate judgment would be passed on them. So there would be punishment ultimately, and that would have, in some cases, result in some form of genocide. In some cases, but ultimately, God has to cast judgment. And I did give a very good example where if you have somebody that committed a crime and say murdered uh, in cold blood, and say a whole family for no good reason, just decided he just didn't like them and decided to just kill them all. or whatever the petty excuse he had, then you would like to see that person sentenced for life imprisonment, or maybe even the death sentence, because he's taken life. Back then, of course, it was life for life back then. So um, that was part of some of the covenants, where there were lives lost. Lives have to be covered and paid for that. That was part of the law, the eye for eye principle. So that was how it was, taking God's principles applied to laws that were set by man to take those principles into place. And at the time, they didn't have the sophistication of the courts and hearings that we have today. So their methodology was a bit more primitive, perhaps, but it was still the same principle. You've taken my life or lives of my people. Therefore, there's a right for that person to be punished or something similar, a equitable punishment for the crime that's committed. And that's no different today. Like I said, if somebody commits a murder, in some states of America and certain parts of the world, the death sentence would be applied. And we would say that that's feasible. So where Matt would say, well, again, why would that not be an okay case? And of course, that's all on the basis that you believe in God. Of course, if you don't believe in God and you don't believe there's anything, we're just natural, some random process. Well, who's to say what is right and wrong, and what law and what is persecution, what is the appropriate punishment? Does beg the question, doesn't it? And then slavery, just to explain this, look, I will probably do this one week, but slavery is a bit of a complicated theory situation. So let me explain a bit more about slavery. You can't just say blanketly slavery, because slavery itself is a concept on the basis that came up when, through war or certain events, there will be basically individuals that will become abandoned, if you like. And this was an issue, certainly from wars, spoils of war, if you like, where there will be basically people that will survive from the war, the enemy, but they needed to be, rather than just being left there, they had to be dealt with. They had to, in some cases, be taken into account, maybe what they did. So they come up with what was then not the slavery we would understand more so today, but back then, initially, it was more about just helping these people. And okay, they are the enemy, so they might not going to be well looked after, but they're still human people. They still have to have some human respect and dignity applied to them. So they were taken originally as slaves, in the sense they were taken like as servants, but they still had to be fed and they had to be treated fairly. Of course, a lot of people over time started to treat them unfairly, treat them as inferior citizens, and the whole of that slavery process started to get abused. And over time, slavery got worse and worse and worse, where now slavery as we know it is more about taking people, abusing them, and treating them as, fourth rate, fifth rate citizens, treating them really badly, not properly feeding them, punishing them, taking advantage of them, whatever it may be. And that's what slavery has got to now. It's got very, very severe. And that's nothing to do with God. This is to do with man's free will of making wrong choices. So taking slavery as it was really to handle situations where people were abandoned in different circumstances, to have something implemented to deal with them, to then it became something far more severe. And I will probably take that up as again as a topic which I'd like to cover, to explain this whole historical understanding of slavery and how it developed over the years. Okay. Well, those were the points that were raised. Those were, for me, what I think were the key points. And what's my takeaway and overall review of all this? Like I intimated a couple of times, I think for me, is whatever the case for God and the case for Christianity, to be believing in God, is to believe in the Bible, believe in the supernatural, believe there is a God, of course, as part of that, and live a life accordingly. But none of that would be satisfactory to Matt, because his standard of evidence has to be something that's empirical, that he can see and be demonstrative in front of him that he can prove is true. But of course, this is not a genuine basis of evidence for this. Because what he's basically saying is this, that we take a scale here, and maybe a scale of 0 to 100, and this is like absolute proof versus the weakest proof. What we're saying is not everything that should be believed that is true always fits that 100% model. In fact, there's very little that does. So Matt's maybe say, okay, I won't say 100%, I'll say 90, 95%. As long as it's 95%. So he's setting his standard, his bar very, very high. And that's what I mean by being skeptical, because it's almost impossible to prove anything at that level. In fact, there's very little that fits that category. So what you have to ask yourself, is there anything that we are aware of that is less than that very high percentage that we would say is generally worth believing in? Of course, there's tons of things, absolute loads of things. Trusting in people, the love of people, the friendship of people would be a good example of that. Lots of things that we just can't explain why it happens, but we still believe in it because the evidence for it is still, say it's, for argument's sake, 60%, 70%. And here's the point. All those things that I would say are in the bracket of, say, for argument's sake, 50% to 70%, 80%, say, are things that has the highest percentage of evidence of proof that it's true versus the alternatives, which is a much lower percentage, and the value of believing in them are worthwhile. So there's a benefit for believing in those things. Would you go ahead and believe it? Especially when there is no real price to pay in believing. So when you're going to believe in God and believe in Christianity, this is the key here. There is no price to pay. In some religions, there's a price to pay. It's a very works-based thing. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And if you don't do this, you don't do this, there are consequences and all this. Not with Christianity, which we believe is the true God. It's purely in the belief what God has done for you. You don't have to do a single thing in terms of your life being turned upside down to change the whole way of life. You can still be you. You can still have the pleasures. The only thing it would say is believe in me. Believe in me genuinely. If you do, then that's all that I'm asking. That's all the God of the Bible is asking, to genuinely believe in him. Now, it does talk about you got to believe in Christ. You got to believe in values and all the rest of it. Let me put it this way. If you truly believe in God, and God has a set of principles and guidelines, and he's, don't forget, the creator of all things, why would you not want to follow them? It's a bit like saying, if I believe in a very, very close friend of mine who's done so much good for me, why would I not want to, shall I say, learn from all the good good advice he's given me? Continually rings me up and says, you know what, I did this the other day and whatever. I recommend you do what? And you do it and you find the benefit. So if you start seeing, okay, God has provided these principles of life and you follow them and you find they're actually good for you, it's not really asking you to change your life. It's helping you fix it. It's helping you to straighten your life out, to then still have your pleasures, still have what you want out of life, but within these rules of principles. And why that's important is, if you don't follow them, anything outside of that has its risks. And it's proven to be the case. When you look at anything outside of, I'll give you an example. God says, have one man, have one wife. What do you see in some cases? People having many wives. Look at all the problems that causes. Look at the people that have sex outside of marriage and just, go around sleeping with whoever. later on they'll find the consequences of that. If you go around lying all the time or stealing all the time and think this is a great fun, there are consequences to these things. They're ultimately going to ruin your life. And when you get old and look back and where it's messed your life up, it's too late. You can't go back and fix it. So when we have tried and tested principles, which is what is clearly outlined in the Bible, it doesn't tell you exactly how to do them. It's a principle. So you can still have your life. You can decide what job you want to do, where you want to live, who you want to marry, where you want to travel, what your hobbies are. That is not challenged at all. Just the principles is the only thing. And if you truly believe in God, you would want to follow his principles. That's the only condition, if you can call it a condition. And I would say that's a very healthy condition that doesn't really challenge. So all you've got to do then is to say, okay, if God is the best or good enough case, certainly Christianity, and you can believe that it's at least convincing enough to be at least 60, 70% convincing and more convincing than anything else with the value it's offering, then you would go ahead. And you do that in many things in life. When you take on a job, you're taking a risk. When you choose to go to a certain supermarket, when you choose to eat at a certain restaurant, when you choose certain friends, all of it is a calculated risk. That is, you can see the benefit, and the benefit outweighs the risks, and the evidence that is worth convincing to worth taking on is a good enough and best possible case. And sometimes you do even do things without it being the best case, but a lot of the times that's your principle. You're going to say that's the best case, I will follow it, and you do that in your life. So long as you can see there's enough convincing evidence to at least believe it's at least 60-70% of a good, genuine, best case scenario to explain things, explain that God is real, then I would simply say, why aren't you at least giving it a go, and not go down this road which Matt has done to say, well, I still not give myself enough evidence. I'm still not convinced enough, so I'm not going to believe it because unless it's 100% or 99.9, whatever, it's not good enough for me. The problem with that is if the things that are a lower percentage prove to be true and have incredible value to life, then Matt, you're simply not gonna you're gonna miss out. And when you end your life, which sadly may not be that long far away, because I know you're not well and you're obviously getting on a bit in age and all the rest of it, you're certainly not going to be here for 50 years plus or whatever. I don't know how many more years, maybe 10, 20, whatever. You're going to look back at that point and go, well, at the end of the day, what have I got that I can go away with now? Nothing. Because I've got no future to look forward to. The life I've led is all what I've led. And I've missed out on anything potentially that could have offered a lot more because I didn't, if you like, take that chance on the basis of that level of probability. And that's where skepticism comes in, because if you're not being honest with yourself, that's what life is all about. We always take these chances. And a bit like an investment. Look how many people invest money. That's a big risk. But they say, based on all the evidence they got, this is a very good case that we think would make a lot of money in this investment. They put the money in there. And some people put life savings, large sums of their money into a single investment. This is the same sort of thing we're talking about. So the evidence for God is very, very strong if you really look at it. If you don't demand the ridiculous, expect evidence that's not being real. Nobody has evidence of those things that could say is that absolute. We all base it on a level of trust. Even the Bible says it's your faith and your trust in God is all that matters. Because if you do, and you believe in Him and put your trust in Him, you will see a result. You will get the evidence, but it'll be a personal one. Every Christian always has a testimony, genuine Christians, that says, I have a relationship with God. I have a communication with God that has flourished and proven to me He's real since the day I started to believe in Him. But of course, if you don't give God a chance, you'll never find that evidence in the first place. And that's what Matt has done. He's completely put the barriers, put a standard that is just too impossible to fulfill. and therefore he's never going to find out and know whether God is real or not. So he almost kind of eliminated God based on those overly high standards that he's given himself. And that for me is a real shame, when there's just so many people in this world that says, wait a minute, there are many things in this world, including God, that we have to trust at a much lesser percentage than 99.9. But we do get the benefit of doing it when we do it, because we have had results in believing something at a much lesser percentage, because that was the option. It was the best option, whether it's 60% or 70%. And I would agree, if it's a low percentage, that's because the evidence isn't good enough. And I would agree, don't believe in those. Those are the things you would not believe in. But the percentage has got to be high. But when it is high, when it's solid and it's the best option, and this is the important thing here when it comes to the source and the origin of the universe, we do know there must be an origin because we exist. We know the universe around us. That's clear cut. So it's worth investigating, and people are investigating it, and the evidence is very, very strong that the universe had a beginning and it had an intelligent source. Why aren't we believing in that? Or at least investigating that further in a more rational, sensible way, rather than putting these ridiculously high standards. So, well, you can't prove this, and prove this. All you're really doing is being skeptical at a high level, preventing really any realistic evidence to be valid, and therefore you're eliminating the possibility of whether it's true or not. And that for me is not a good approach. And I think that's what this debate was really all about, that Cliff was really trying to explain that, this is the methodology you should use. These are the steps you should take to test and prove whether it's God, whether Christianity is true, but you're not doing that. And the only difference is what I'm saying is this is the reason that didn't come out so well in the debate is because of the ridiculously high standards and unreasonableness in the methodology of testing, improving things, especially in terms of the supernatural, in terms of God, are just simply not the right methods to use. And that would be my conclusion of this debate. We're coming up to 1 hour 30. I think that would be a good time to stop. I hope you've enjoyed it for those who are watching, and I hope it really made you think about a few things. I will look forward to all your comments, positive or good or negative. Please do put your comments. Those who have enjoyed it, please let me know. That would be good too. So hope you've enjoyed it. Until next week, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next week, but in the meantime, I'll do some shorts, get people thinking, all at the end of the day to find truth. That's the whole point of the ministry. So hopefully you've enjoyed this one. Until the next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye for now.